Hi there guys, welcome to today's recording. I'm going to go through the 2020 Level 1 Science Genetic Examination paper. So you can obviously find the examination paper online on the NCEA website as long as the marking schedule, but I'll try my best to explain the thought process of how to go about with some of these questions. Okay, so if you a large number of my of the viewers of my videos unsubscribed, so if you could leave a like, if you have any questions, leave a comment in the comment section, and subscribe as well. That'll make a big difference and help me grow the channel. Okay, so let's get started. Question number 1, Huntington disease. I swear I've seen this particular question before. I think it was one of the older examination papers that I've seen, but this is a genetic disorder, blah, blah, blah. It's caused by dominant allele H. So Huntington's disease is caused by this capital H allele, recessive is small h. So for the possible, okay, so this is pretty easy. So what are the possible genotypes? You have capital H, you have capital H, small h, and you have small h. And just so you know what they are, so the top one, this is homozygous dominant, the middle one is heterozygous, and this one here is homozygous recessive. So the phenotype, this one will be having Huntington disease. I'm not going to write the whole thing. This one's going to have Huntington's disease, and this one is going to be, this person is going to be normal. Okay, so why is that? Because the dominant allele, as long as you have one capital letter, that means you have at least one dominant allele, and that particular phenotype will always be displayed. Okay, so just make sure you understand that, and explain how the two alleles H, capital H and lowercase h, combine to produce two different compounds to produce different phenotypes. And you should define what phenotype and genotypes are, and explain how the three genotypes code for only two phenotypes. Okay, so phenotype is the, if you look at the word, if you look at the spelling, phenotype, this is to do with physical characteristic, and genotype is the combination of the alleles. So it is really important that you know what these definitions are. So genotype, this is the combination of alleles. So this is what the combination of alleles from each parent, and then the combination determines what the trait would look like. And the phenotype, this is the physical characteristic, or the physical representation of what the genotypes are, characteristics of the genotype. Okay, so this is the genotype determines what the phenotype is. We can't see the genotype because that's in your blood, that's in your genes, that's in your cells. We can't see that. Phenotype is what what is physically being displayed. And explain how 3 genotype codes for only 2 phenotypes. So you just need to kind of explain that the H, which is the dominant allele, when you have the H, when you have that, it's gonna be dominant over the recessive allele. Therefore, whenever you have at least one capital H, you're always going to have the Huntington disease. Okay, you're always going to have that. But if you have homozygous recessive, when you have both of the alleles being non-affected, being the recessive allele, then you have the recessive trait. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers here. So genotype, again, genotype is a combination of the alleles. Phenotype is a physical representation of the genotype. Okay, so remember the H allele is dominant. So in HH, capital H, in heterozygous, in capital H lowercase h, which is known as heterozygous, the dominant allele shadows the small h, and then the phenotype is affected by Huntington. So you have, when you have both recessive alleles, that means you would have a normal person that's not affected by Huntington's disease. Okay, and then so homozygous dominant and heterozygous, which is capital H lowercase, are both affected. Okay, so it's a very straightforward question. You just need to know what the words mean. Okay, and oh my god, how many times have you seen this question? So explain the relationship between DNA, genes, alleles, mutations, and phenotype. You don't just memorize the definitions, guys. It's so, and for my guys, I even printed out something for them and I just gave it to them because it's every single year they ask questions like this, I really get tired of explaining them over and over again because it just shows up every single time. So DNA, so think about this, yeah. So if we use a diagram, this is your DNA double helix structure, and so this is your DNA, and your DNA contains your genetic information. So this has all of your genetic information in the double strand of molecules, and the single section, like I said, this is a small section, this is known as a gene. A gene is a small section that codes for this is a section of DNA, it codes for one trait, one particular protein, and then when you have different of the same gene, you have different versions of the different version of the same gene, different versions of the same gene, which is known as an allele. Where do the alleles come from? Because alleles have different base sequencing. And what is base sequencing again? Base sequence is the ATCG stuff that you learn at the very beginning of the topic. Okay, so the big thing is the DNA. One small section is a gene, which is codes for one particular trait, and as you know that for the same characteristic, there's different versions of the characteristic, which is known as alleles. Why do alleles occur? Because chemically they have different base sequences. Okay, and what is mutation? Mutation is a change. Mutation is a permanent change of the DNA base sequence, which creates a new allele, and that new allele will create a new phenotype. Okay, so this just every single year you see questions like that, so just make sure you understand what it is. So here's some definitions. So DNA contains the genetic instructions, genetic information, material, whatever you want to call it. A gene is a section of DNA, codes for one particular protein, one particular feature, one particular characteristic, one particular trait. We accept all of those words. And alleles are different versions of the same gene. They have different base sequence, and they'll code for different phenotypes. And then the mutations, a change in the order of the base sequence, makes new allele, makes new protein, which means a new phenotype. Okay, so just as you can see, one big thing they've been doing here is that they're trying to relate to the question. So if they specifically asked you, let's see if they did. Yeah, they did. See, I didn't even highlight that. Yeah, so you see that bit that I'm highlighting now? Use Huntington's disease as an example. Okay, so you need to link to the question. A lot of people just get trigger happy and say, oh, I know this question, definition of DNA, genes, chromosomes. I know, I've memorized this, let's write it out. But if you don't link to the into the question, you will get marked down. Okay, because the question has specifically asked you to do that. Next one, this is a pedigree chart. All right, so this is another polycystic kidney disease. Oh my God, there's so many genetic disorders here. So let's have a look at this one. So we know the disease is caused by the dominant allele. The unaffected is recessive. Okay, so I'm just gonna, because a lot of you are here because of the explanation, because you can all find the answers online. So let's just do a little bit extra. Let's think about this here. So if this is the dominant allele, that means let's read it again. Affected is dominant, so the affected, these guys must have at least one capital D. Okay, so this has capital D, something else, capital D, something else, capital D, something else, capital D, capital D, capital D, something else. We don't know what the other one is. Okay, so for someone to be unaffected, there has to be homozygous recessive. Okay, so this is small d, and then you get the idea, small d. If you have trouble with pedigree charts, have a look at my pedigree charts videos. Hopefully that will make more sense. Okay, so if we see this now, straight away you can see that number 1 and number 2 had how many children? They have children 3, 5, 6, which are all displaying the disease, this particular condition. So we actually don't know what that is. That could be a small d, could be a big D. It's all possible. So we don't know. But if you look at generation 3 and 4, can you see this individual number 7, because it's giving us 2 small d's. Remember, these letters, each one of these letters must come from each parent. So one letter from each parent. So let's say the left one from mom, the right one from dad, for example. That means number 3 has to be heterozygous, because for individual 7 to have homozygous recessive, it has to get a small d from mom, small d from dad, and which means it did in case of number 3 and number 4. Okay, and we don't, and for number 8, number 9, this has to be big D, small d, big D, small d. All right, so, and if you want more detailed explanation on Punnett squares, go have a look at my Punnett square video online. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So we did more than what we're supposed to do, because I when I see a pedigree chart, that's the first thing I do, just like solving puzzles. It's just a bit fun for me. All right, now complete the Punnett square between individual 1, which is homozygous recessive, and individual 2 heterozygous. Oh, they even told us that 2 is heterozygous. Thank you. So number 1 is homozygous recessive. Now just again definitions. Homozygous recessive means you have, it's small d, 2 small letters. Heterozygous means you have big D, small d, one of each. Okay, so this is small d, and then capital D, small d, and this is just a simple Punnett squares. And if you're wondering what I did with that, you just like say, if I want to figure out what this is, you look up, you look to the left, you look to the right, and combine them together. Put the capital letter in the front. If you don't have a capital letter, put the 2 single letters, small lowercase letters together. List a genotype of the following 2 individuals. Individual 3, individual 4. So already did that. Individual 3 is capital D, small d, and individual 4 is small d, small d. Now explain how you worked it out for individual number 3. So again, we talked about this just now. Let's use a different color pen. So we know number 4 is small d, small d. Number 3 has a capital D question mark, and then they have children. And we don't care about 8 and 9. We look at number 7. Number 7, if you look up here, number 7 is unaffected. Number 7 is unaffected, which means number 7 must be small d, small d. So in order for number 7 to have small d genotype, that means this is not a question mark anymore. This has to be a small d. Okay, and that's just pretty much how you figure it out, and how you explain it is kind of over here. Now, so it's heterozygous, so could pass on big D, small d alleles because it's heterozygous, blah blah blah. And parent 2 must have passed down a capital D for individual 3 to be. So that's just looking at the pedigree chart. If you look at the chart, number 3, if you look at the chart, number 3, because it's affected, that means it must have the capital D allele. Okay, and blah blah. Now the offspring, this part is actually not that good here. But if you look at this part, the offspring of number 3 and number 4 are both affected or unaffected, which means 3 must have big D, small d, because number 7 is small d, therefore has inherited a D allele from both parent 3 and 4. This means 3 must have a small d, and it also must have a big D because it's affected, and therefore it is heterozygous. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully that makes sense. Now next one of the family members have kidney failure as a result of an infection, and to discuss if this type of kidney failure can be inherited. No, you can't, because infection is not genetic. So you need to understand the difference between diseases and whatnot. So if it occurs due to environment, and the other one is genetics, which is looking at gametes productions in particular. When you look at environment changes, they are not inheritable. Okay, because like say for example, if a guy walks down the street, have a car accident, and loses a finger, for example, does that mean if this guy was gone to have children, do all of his children have 9 fingers? No, that's not happening, because that's not genetic. It's just due to the environment, it was an accident, it cannot be inherited. But if it was a genetic condition, which is also passed on in the gametes production, and then that will be going on to the offsprings. Okay, so here we go. It's due to the infection. It's just common sense. You just need to explain it properly, because it's caused by the environment, so it's not genetics. Only genetic characteristics can be inherited. Okay, so what is genetic characteristics that can be inherited is looking at the gamete production. Okay, so if it was a if this particular change or mutation or whatnot has occurred in the genes, and then that will be passed down to the future generations, which is a bit unfortunate. Okay, next one. Avian malaria is a parasitic disease affecting hoiho, and which can lead to death. Oh, that's unfortunate. Describe genetic variation. So what is genetic variation? So genetic variation in simple words is just differences. Okay, so the word variation, this is just differences. Variation just means difference, and then genetic variation means differences in genes, or phenotype, phenotype, genotype, allele, genes, DNA, genetic information. That's anything that we accept, I'm pretty sure, in this particular order. So it just doesn't really matter. So it's just differences. Variation just means differences in any one of these. The ability to fight disease, that's just I think this is just the way that NCEA trying to give you guys achieves. Because being a marker myself, it is sometimes the things that we do to give you guys an extra achieve is really, as a teacher, it's quite painful, because we're literally trying to give you guys marks because you're not passing. But after these videos, hopefully you're not in that particular position. Okay, now because you'll be getting decent grades, not just achieved. Now next one, explain how sexual reproduction causes genetic variation in the population, blah blah blah, use of gamete formation. Okay, so they even told you that it's gamete formation and fertilization. So I explained this explicitly in my in one of my previous videos about sexual reproduction, so you should definitely check that out. But its variation is caused by two parts, but they specifically want you to talk about sexual reproduction, but I'll just do both, because again, I often think about, because if they ask you the question, in previous years, they probably will change it a little bit in the following year. They're not going to ask exactly the same question next year, but sometimes you can be surprised how similar the exam papers are year to year. But these are the two big factors that causes variation. One is sexual reproduction, one is mutation. Now, in this case, you don't need to talk about mutation, because that's not part of the question. They talk about how sexual reproduction works. So for sexual reproduction, the first thing that we want to look at is meiosis. Meiosis produces unique gametes. Okay, so the gametes are all unique. The sex cells are all unique. So they have half the number of chromosomes, and they are all unique because of during meiosis, you have independent assortment or random assortment, whatever, depends on what textbooks you read. Independent assortment and crossing over, which means that the alleles swap bits and pieces of information, and then they produce genetically unique gametes. Okay, so the gametes are unique because they all contain half of the chromosomes, and when these guys are being produced, because of the way that they are produced, independent assortments and crossing over happens. Okay, now that's not just it there. And then we have fertilization. Fertilization is that the gametes that will end up fertilizing are completely random. So out of the tens of billions of random sperms that get a fertilizer, become a zygote and become a baby, which one of those guys get to do that is completely random. Okay, so the random gametes from the male and female fuse together, and each individual time that occurs is an independent event from the previous offspring. So each sibling in your family are similar, but then you're not going to be exactly alike. Okay, so the purpose of sexual reproduction is that you produce variation in the population. There's different, possibly new combination of alleles, because the alleles are a little bit different, and that's what it does. Now for mutation is a change. This is going back to one of the previous questions before. This is changing the base sequence. Okay, so this is changing the base sequence of an allele, and then you create new alleles. I've already talked about this in question before. So you probably have new genotype, and phenotype. And then if this was advantageous, like say all of a sudden this particular animal had a mutation, and then it gave it a significant advantage over the other individuals, that means this guy is going to live longer, reproduce more, and then pass on the genes, and then this mutation will pass on through the generations and actually becomes a norm. Okay, so that's the power of evolution. So let's have a look at the answers. So this is going to be a bit long, obviously, to guarantee the excellent answer. So because this particular topic is about genetic variation, so you can expect how they will ask you how is variation achieved. Okay, so you learn your sexual reproduction processes, you learn your meiosis, you learn your fertilization, and then you learn your mutation. That will guarantee, I'll guarantee you that question will pop up because it's written on the standard. That is the title of the achievement standard, so you can definitely expect that particular question to show up on the exam paper. Okay, now gamete formation. So let's look at this. So what's sexual reproduction? Sexual reproduction is first thing first, we're looking at gamete formation by meiosis. We make gametes, which are half cells. They have half number of chromosomes, and then you can even talk about one produces 4, but because of random assortment, the crossing over of the chromosomes, and they produce genetically unique gametes. Now these gametes, these random gametes, then each one of them randomly joined together, and then each with unique genetic information, they produce a genetically unique zygote or an offspring or an individual. I've seen people writing babies and things like that. I think I would have accepted it from having marked genetics for a while, but I think I would have accepted it, but it's just not very good terminology. And just to give you a hint, don't refer everything to humans, okay? Because it's probably the best species that you know about genetics, but don't relate everything to human beings, because this particular question is talking about birds. If the question asks you to link to the question, and then you start talking about humans have this XY blah blah, all this number of chromosomes and 23 pairs of chromosomes, it's like, what are you talking about? We're not even talking about human beings here. Okay, so try to stick with the question, and then just it's about using the correct words, not just waffle and just write loads and loads of nonsense. Just short, precise, hit all the key points, and then you should be getting really good results. Okay, and just last bit. So first, your oral sexual reproduction, random combination of alleles producing unique offsprings. Okay, and last one, before I even read it, I can even tell you what is the benefit of sexual reproduction. There you go, having variation. There you go. Well, how does variation lead to increased survival? So it's all about having genetic variation means that the population will have different slight difference in the genetics, slight difference in the genotypes and phenotypes. So if there was a disease or drought or natural disaster or chemical climate change or whatnot, chemicals being leaked, blah blah blah, then some of the individuals will be able to survive because they're all different. Some of them can adapt. If they can adapt, they can survive. They can pass on the genes, and boom, population will continue, and then the species is safe. Yay. Okay, so just every single year this question comes up, so just make the most out of it. I've seen some really creative answers in the past, but here it is. And then they specifically talk about malaria, which is a disease. And have you not sure if you guys even noticed, a lot of the questions, like if you look through the past exam papers, excuse me, if you look at the especially the genetics one, they have a lot of pictures, they have a lot of context. You don't even need to, like a lot of people came out of exams and come and ask me, it's like, so what is this tree, like you never told me the tree. I was like, that's not the point. The point is that they give you the context, and then they say, all right, this tree has this particular genetic disorder, explain to me what mutation is. So they always give you context, they always give you fancy pictures. You don't like the way you saw me explain. I didn't even go through those particular contexts because it doesn't really matter. That's not the emphasis of this particular standard. The emphasis is on genetics, is on the genetics variation. So just remember, variation enables some individual to survive because they have different alleles, they're all slightly different. They can pass it on to next generations, and over generations this particular trait will be passed on, and then the what do you call it, this particular trait will become the norm, and then the population will continue. Okay, so just stick with the couple, like don't get too creative. Like I said, I've seen some really creative stuff in the exam booklets, but just stick to your disease. Disease is by far the best advantage to talk about in terms of having genetic variation. With genetic variation, your species is more prone to more resilient towards a disease outbreak. Like say right now we have COVID going on. Then if you from the stories I've heard, I personally don't know anyone that have had the nasty virus, but from the stories I've read, some people get hit really bad, and some people have caught it, don't even feel a thing. So it varies a little bit between individuals. So it's good to have that variation in the population, bringing it back to why we're doing it here. And if you can't remember that, surely you watch some, like I mentioned before, surely you watch some TV shows or play some video games that have zombies in it. Just think about why the main characters aren't zombies, but then the other poor things that they're shooting at turn into zombies because of genetic variation, because that the main character or the main lead, or they are immune, they are different, they have different alleles, they have different genes, and they don't catch onto the virus, and then they survive, and they give you 10 seasons, 12 seasons of Walking Dead. I don't even know how many seasons it is now. Okay, so that's how this particular standard tend to work out. And so this is a very standard exam paper, nothing too tricky, nothing too new. Very fair. So I hope that that helps. So yeah, I think that's the end. So like always, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll go through the other 2020 exams as well in the near future. Okay, so all the best, take care, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.